that is not a great atmosphere or environment or mindset to learn from.
Agreed. Absolutely. You know, I have questions too. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the piece about school. We could, you know, turn the direction of the show into an hour-long conversation about, you know, that milieu alone and the problems it poses to young learners, especially those learners later in life, right? But and the authorities that they will blindly trust, which is a huge problem. But it also raises the question about how to establish that type of relationship that you think is so important, because not everybody might be on board with the whole learner and teacher as peer. Now, I'll tell you, I remember like from 2004 to 2006, I was teaching history, and the first year that I did it with a group of high school students, I was a little upset and I think even down on myself about the lack of student engagement. And the next year, I got a student. This was Vermont, and the student was black. And I only point that out because that's noteworthy in Vermont. But it can also he was very socially aware, and I remember he said to me one time, "All your stories are so predictable. Some white guy rides in on a horse at the end and saves the day." You know, and I remember liking the challenge, like the first year I taught not having that kind of student engagement. And then the second year, like initially being very, very grateful that I had this student who wanted to challenge even what I thought was a very hip revisionist version of American history, you know, but I remember as time went on and more students saw that this was okay. And I tried to like really say, you know, ask questions, let's have a discussion, that kind of thing. But until they saw it modeled by another student who I really liked, I had a good relationship with the student, but I felt like it almost became at times, and I never said this obviously, but it was just a feeling that it was like annoying. You know, that like, hey, I worked all summer to prepare these lessons for you, the uninitiated. And I've had, I think, for, you know, ever since I like left graduate school a few years before I had that teaching experience, I've had an attitude that I would describe as healthier than most people in those positions of authority towards the needs of young people. But I couldn't help at times feel annoyed by the fact like, hey, we're just having a discussion here. Hey, we're all trying to learn and figure things out. And maybe you, Mr. Benot, are wrong. That was like, I don't know. I didn't like the way that felt. But I would think that a lot of teachers would not necessarily welcome that kind of relationship. And I'm wondering if you have any strategies for how a learner could work to make a teacher aware of that need for that relationship or their desire to build it.
It's an excellent question, and it's an excellent example. And from my own personal experience, discovering the most efficient process of learning is not necessarily strongly correlated with building friendships with your instructors. Because it is the case that people do have some measure of pride involved in the work, and I think to some degree that's okay, to challenge people who are in positions or just de facto positions of authority in terms of them teaching can be very upsetting to people. What I would say is, practically speaking, there are a couple of things you can do. One, you can try to deliberately seek out those instructors, those professors or mentors who have some degree of humility enough where they can stomach the annoyance. This is something that is very strong in the world of ideas. This is something that's very strong in the world of the martial arts, where there are some instructors that you can't essentially talk to them without the appropriate belt, right? The appropriate rank. Then you can start having meaningful conversation. That's bollocks. That is not a healthy way to learn. There are other people who do not require that degree of hierarchy and pecking order. So what I would say is, now it's more difficult when you're in school, right? Because you can't just say, oh, well, I'm going to have another history teacher. I mean, that's not the way it works. You have to navigate, you know, with the tools that you're given.
Right.
The other part of this is another theoretical example of why it's the case that just trusting that your instructor is competent in telling you the truth is a mistaken way of trying to learn. And it's very analogous to the methodology of faith. Faith is this idea that there are some propositions which are it's not necessarily required to inspect their premises. You can just accept them with faith on face value. Mm-hmm. This is ultimately the same methodology of trusting your instructors and trusting the experts. Ultimately, that's what it is. Now, the reasoning is a little bit different, but ultimately the conclusion is the same, that for reasons that I do not have to inspect, this proposition is true because it was communicated to me from this person. And I'm sure that some teachers would like the idea that they are in positions of such authority that students will just accept what they say. But in terms of understanding, you have to be more realistic than friendly in approaching these things. Like, look, I recognize that you have some experience and that obviously you think you know what you're talking about, but I'm going to assume, just for my own sake, that you don't. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and you'll find people that maybe if you explain that directly with them, you have a one-on-one conversation, who are going to be open to that. Like if I were trying to teach somebody the basics of chess, I would say, look, please do grill me. Like, assume that I don't know what I'm talking about. Try to poke holes in my theory and my game and the things that I'm teaching you, because quite frankly, the truth is, though teachers may not understand this, the truth of the matter is that everybody is ultimately a learner first. And if people think that their divine role is teaching, they're mistaken. It's ultimately learning.
I think there's a balance for that too, that the student, be it online or in a classroom, has to have some awareness of a kind of continuum, right? So I could see somebody, like, say, who has a significant following on YouTube or a blog in philosophy or economics, who's put in 20 plus years of experience, becoming annoyed with somebody who's relatively new to all of these ideas, but has just this dubious nature. Right now, it's certainly fine to be skeptical, fine to be inquisitive, but I think the student-teacher dynamics that are set up in this country, that's kind of what contributed to me feeling like, well, wait a minute, I read books about this, student, and it also kind of comes back to the idea of hard work, right? I put in my 20 years. Have you ever read a book called Disciplined Minds by a physicist named Jeff Schmidt? And he talks about how in higher education, really in the medical field and in the scientific field, people are psychologically broken in the pursuit of those credentials. And part of it is like the professors who've probably done a lot of field experience, or maybe they've just been in academia their entire career. They want to punish students almost for their inexperience, like as if to say, you need to suffer the same way I suffered in the pursuit of this knowledge, right? And one of Schmidt's conclusions and caveats in the book is that the training process in these sciences, where you think people are, certainly giving you the truth, after all, this is science, are people who ultimately, through their training, become non-critical thinkers, very trusting of the authorities in their field, and ultimately kind of complacent in their search for knowledge. So I think there's, again, the student-teacher dynamics that are set up lead to a lot of problems in the sense of superiority for the teacher over the learner. But I think the balance is that there also needs to be this respect that learners recognize, and again, having ways to test this, like we've already talked about, and establish a kind of competence of the teacher, because there are plenty of incompetent teachers out there, but just a respect for the continuum, or a way to say, yes, this continuum exists. Let's see if this person's 20-year head start on me around this track actually gives them this legitimately gives them this authority, I guess I should say.
Yes, this is directly related to kind of the last piece of the puzzle that I wanted to cover about the principle of skepticism. And it has to do with the actual process of learning, like the mechanical process of learning and incorporating doubt into that process. It's directly related to what you're talking about. And just for sake of ease, I'll keep going back to the martial arts, though you can abstract away and apply this to any field of any discipline or any field of thought. My instructor, when I went in, right, I couldn't know off the get-go that this was a competent person who knew what he was talking about. I didn't know anything. One of the basic techniques that you learn in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is called the hip escape. It's a basic movement that you use all the time to get out of a lot of positions. It's absolutely essential. Now, I had no idea why that's the case. I was just told, okay, you have to, like part of the warm-up for a lot of these classes, okay, do hip escapes back and forth across the floor because they're so important. Well, I didn't. Why? That's the premise. Well, I don't know if that's true, right? In Hakaru Jiu-Jitsu or Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, I was learned different basics. Why should I just assume that these basics are correct and those basics are incorrect? And so what I did explicitly was ask, like, okay, what is the point of this? It's not like, oh, I'm going to get you, you incompetent fool, like you don't know what you're talking about. It's, I genuinely don't know. I'm skeptical, but there's also this possibility I'm entertaining because I've experienced it, that the basics that I'm being taught aren't actually sound basics. And I was told and it was demonstrated to me, look, this is why this particular movement is the basics. So this is true, especially in the world of ideas. When you're trying to learn something, you're trying to learn the basic concepts of comparative advantage in economics. You can't simply take what the professor tells you and says, this is one of the foundational concepts in economics. Okay. And then it's rote learning. You state it and you think you know what you're talking about. That's not a good way of learning. You have to think, well, why? Maybe it's not. Maybe comparative advantage is not a foundational concept in economics. And because if it's not clear to me, I have to ask, well, could you explain that to me? Is there a way that is wrong? You know, you try to poke holes in it, and then what you'll discover is, if your teacher is competent and the technique that he's teaching you or the ideas that he's teaching you are accurate, that you're going to get a satisfactory answer. You're going to see why the hip escape is important. You're going to see why comparative advantage is important. And I think tying this back to the student-teacher relationship, teachers should understand that. They should be excited to say, look, let's talk, let's have a whole class on the concept of comparative advantage and try to prove me wrong. So for me, like in martial arts, like I said, I have a ton of respect for my instructor. I do assume, because he's demonstrated over and over and over, that I can trust what he's saying. However, it's not blind trust. It's not faith. It's not the assumption that, oh, it is correct and I'm never going to challenge it. It's just I have learned, empirically speaking, though I may not know why this is some important technique, if I challenge him, when I challenge him and I try to learn, I'm probably going to find a satisfactory answer. Absolutely critically important.
Yeah, satisfactory answers are a fantastic test. I've been subjected to that test as a teacher, as a tutor. I always try to pass. I never try to wield that, instructor authority over people. And I think it exposes a lot. And I think that everybody here, whether it was in secondary school where the quest for satisfactory answers from authority figures really begins. Like I remember in elementary school, I was just so impressed with adults. I really didn't, what was I going to ask them? They're twice my size. They can drive cars. They cook me food. I would die without them. But by the time you get to start looking and feeling like an adult, a lot of these authority figures become far less impressive. And yes, you do have more questions for them, especially in this painful schooling experience. Somewhat related to this, as far as satisfactory answers are concerned, remember having a big family dinner one time, and there was a bunch of adults and a bunch of children there. And one of the people, we were talking politics at dinner, and this person was just railing against Obama. And then later, as they did time and time again, later I heard him say to his son, when his son was on a quest, as young children often are, not to test the credentials of adults just because they want to know things.
Right.
Right. It's not a test. It's like an actual quest for knowledge. Why? And this adult, this Obama critic, said, because I said so. And I said later on, you really, the criticism of Obama and the because I said so, it's like you realize that those kinds of explanations for young children are slowly like paving the path to power of people like Obama. You know, so if you think that Obama came to power because of other people's, you know, acceptance of bullshit or just general practices in uncritical thinking, I would say don't contribute to that. It was one of the most confronting conversations I actually had with a parent. That's really a minefield, or it can be, you know, talking to other people about their parenting. But I thought it was such an interesting example that, like, here's somebody who wanted an answer to a question and they got the argument from authority, basically, instead.
It's a very profound example. And so the question is this: what qualifies as a satisfactory answer? This is another difficult question. It's really important to try to find the correct answer to that, although I don't think there's one universal answer that will be applicable in every circumstance. Let me give you a profound analogy. We'll start in the martial arts, and then we'll apply it to the world of ideas. In Hakaru Jiu-Jitsu, which is this Japanese Jiu-Jitsu I was talking about, and in a lot of Japanese Jiu-Jitsus, there are techniques called wrist locks, which are where you put your wrist. Wrist is a very weak joint, and you can manipulate it very easily to cause a lot of pain with minimal effort. Wrist locks are really, really cool. However, when you're learning wrist locks, there are some fundamental assumptions which people in Japanese Jiu-Jitsu world do not question, or they do not question deeply enough. So if we were to take the child's mindset approach and say, okay, well, you know, in this particular position, I'm going to move your wrist this way, and it's going to, you know, cause your joints to lock up, and then I'm going to take you down to the ground because of it. And when we take the child's position, we say, okay, well, why? And the person explains, okay, well, look, we'll get your arm in this position. Isn't that uncomfortable? And to relieve the tension, you have to go to the ground. If that is as far as the inquiry goes, and somebody thinks that's a satisfactory answer, they're going to be tricked by a framing error. Because something that these people usually are not consciously aware of is that one of the premises with wrist locks is that you have to have a relaxed opponent, or you have to get the wrist lock going before there's a lot of tension in the opponent's wrist. Well, it turns out when you're actually fighting with somebody, those windows are very, very small. So wrist locks are amazing. They're powerful. They're profound. They can do a lot of great things. They're tricky. They're amazing. 2% of the time. Mm-hmm. And so if it is not a satisfactory answer to say, oh, look, isn't this uncomfortable? Let's take it down to the ground. You have to go all the way. You have to say, well, I understand that might work, but does that position come up a lot? Is it the case that you're going to find an opponent who has a relaxed wrist in a real circumstance? And that's the kind of thing that you don't get in these insular fields of the martial arts. This is, again, we'll take it out of that particular case in the martial arts and apply it into something like economics or philosophy. Philosophy, for example, this is something I'm writing my book about that will be out hopefully in the next month or two. Take logical reasoning. So we say, for example, there is no square circle. Okay, this is a certain proposition. Well, why is it the case that there's no square circle? Because, well, it's just self-evident, and then they move on. Okay, could that be a satisfactory explanation? Maybe. What if I were to say, well, the reason that there is no square circle is because of logic and logical necessity? Is that a satisfactory explanation? Well, it could be. Can you go any deeper? Why is it the case that there is this thing that is logical necessity? What is logical necessity? Now, if you don't have an answer for that, your conclusion that there is no square circle might be flawed because it's based on these premises that you might not have examined. And of course, the answer is the nature of logical necessity is such that it results in certain conclusions about the world, which is, if you're interested, this is what I write a lot about. That's what my book's about. But if you don't go that deep, then you're going to be making the same error as the Japanese jiu-jitsu practitioner who thinks that his wrist locks are justified when actually they aren't.
Okay, so related to that, I was thinking while I was preparing for this show about maybe some strategies that we could offer, or some of my own strategies. You've offered a bunch already for improving skeptical thinking. And, the first one, just based on what we've done here so far, learning the basics, logic, arguments, what constitute an argument, and what are the tricks that people use to make you think they're having an argument with you or using arguments against you in the form of fallacies, would definitely be one of those things. Practicing the basics. And I think that, I felt for a long time like I was really satisfied with the knowledge that fallacies exist, as a kind of place to, almost like a place to stop, right? Because, now it is incredibly useful because once you know that the fallacies exist, all kinds of BS starts to just appear around you. It's like when you hear a word that, or you learn the definition of a word and then you start hearing it all the time.
Yeah.
Even without learning the fallacies, learning that these are tools being used against you rhetorically, when that comes into existence, if you are increasingly mindful about that, you start to see them in more and more places. So I would say a kind of practicing looking for them. And one that I think we've really covered sufficiently is a kind of reflection, right? A kind of self-doubt. But these were basically just strategies for more skeptical thinking. And I wanted to talk about an article that you wrote recently. It was called The Death of Skepticism. And in this article, you make a distinction between what you call pop skepticism, where we see a tremendous amount of logical problems, and you contrast this to proper skepticism.
Yes.
So, building on what we've talked about so far, define pop skepticism.
So pop skepticism is a set of conclusions. In the world of ideas, especially thanks to the internet, there are a large group of people who self-identify as skeptics. And in doing so, what that usually means is that they self-identify with a set of conclusions rather than a methodology, rather than having systemic doubt. They have a set of conclusions about the world. So, for example, they are almost universally empiricists, they are atheists, and they are physicalists or materialists. In other words, there's nothing supernatural. Obviously, science is the method for discerning truth from falsehood. And obviously, the physical world is all that exists. That consciousness, for example, is something that is necessarily something that is reducible to physical reality. These are ideas that people assume universally are the case in the skeptics community. And I think it's really a shame because I contrast this to what I call proper skepticism, or perhaps you could call it old school skepticism. What skepticism used to be was a method. It was a methodology for interpreting knowledge about the world. It's what we've been talking about this whole time. It's assuming that maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, that maybe other people don't know what they're talking about, and I'm going to try to put every proposition through an intellectual meat grinder before I accept it.
Right.
So, yeah.
It was examination, it was inquiry, it was, consideration of other people's opinions, and not just a way to shame people. As much as it's become today. I remember my webmaster said to me recently, being an atheist on the internet 10 years ago was much harder than it is today. You actually had to do these processes. Today, there people just want to hand you things,
Yes.
and people will take it right up. So they're not there. And again, I think that this factors in a really important emotional component to learning and trying to understand reality as well, because there is such a widespread and seemingly endless disagreement out there regarding issues that seem like the most important issues. People want a kind of comfort, a kind of intellectual safe space, if I dare. And I think that when somebody emerges as a kind of guru, as we've seen, you mentioned in the article, the Brights movement led
Yes.
by people like Dawkins,
Yep.
that's what they get, that is, and I don't know if he's aware that he must be aware that he's built this kind of sycophantic movement around him, and others as well. You would think if they were really, really committed to logic and skepticism, that they would say, hey, everybody, slow down. You know, you've got a lot of work to do on your own, but the same is true with Sam Harris. Like, people go and see these people talk, not to, I mean, I don't want to say it's everybody, but a lot of people are not there for thinking. They're there for eating out of somebody else's hand.
Yes, I call it a fashionable click.
Mm.
That's what it is. It's like when you're in high school. Of course, I was homeschooled, so I can only speak for other people's experiences. When you're in high school, the cliques that form about the jocks and the nerds and the preps, and you have the brights, or the self-described brights,
Mm-hmm.
who are who from their bubble, from their insular bubble, look down at everybody who doesn't see the obviousness of their conclusions. And it's really a shame, because for virtually all of human history, questions like, does God exist, were treated very seriously. And for good reason. And now, just in the past, I don't know, decade or so, these are things that are mocked. Even asking the question is mocked. And it's actually very related to what we were talking about in the first 3 videos. The reason is because people don't get the basics right? They have the framing errors. I've talked to countless people who say, oh, well, obviously God doesn't exist because God entails a logical contradiction. And then they move on.
Mm-hmm.
Like, whoa, no. If God entails a logical contradiction, if that conception is a logical contradiction, of course a God doesn't exist. But that's not what theologians are arguing. And that's what these so-called brights in the skeptics movement doesn't get, is that they've made framing errors. It's just they're just fighting a bunch of strawmen, and there's no intellectual respectability in just having a conclusion that beats a bunch of strawmen. People don't realize that the arguments for communism, the arguments for God, the arguments for dualism or idealism, all these radical ideas can actually be very critically defended. In fact, more critically defended, most likely, than the actual arguments that the atheist, the empiricist, and materialist will be able to make.
Okay, so I'm going to challenge you to expand on that just a little bit with what I thought was one of the most confronting lines in your article, certainly one of the most interesting lines. If you think all Mormons are crazy, you aren't being skeptical enough.
That's right.
Can you elaborate on that?
Certainly. And Mormon is just a placeholder. You can take the most radical idea conceivable and put it in there. The reason is because you only get to periphery conclusions once you have established an accurate foundation. So I view worldviews like a tree, right? The conclusions are the leaves, and then you have the branches, and then you have the trunk, and then you have the roots. Mm-hmm. And the leaves are ultimately irrelevant. Mormonism or communism, whatever, is ultimately irrelevant. Those aren't really things you should evaluate, and you have to evaluate the premises. So, for example, what is the nature of the self? Is it the case that the human being is a brain in a skull? Is it that we are a spirit? Is it that we are a consciousness? Is it that, as the Eastern mystics would argue, is it that we are ultimately everything? That there is no difference between the self and the not self? We are everything. Now, you may think on its face that seems ridiculous, but in fact, when you examine these questions, it's not so clear. I have my own set of conclusions based on it, trying to critically evaluate these arguments. But I'll be damned if you can't make a really good case for theism or atheism or mysticism. All of that's there. And so if it's the case, for example, that we are eternal spirits that are connected to our bodies, and that there is a God out there that intentionally put those spirits into the bodies, then it becomes less unreasonable to think, well, okay, maybe God then cares about the state of our souls and bodies. And so, yeah, he inhabited a body himself, and he was this person of Jesus. And then this person of Jesus did all these things and wonderful things to show the way to human beings. Yeah, okay, that makes sense if you accept the premises that we are an eternal soul that was put here by a higher power. So what you need to do is not examine Mormonism's conclusions. You have to examine the premises. And in doing so, you can arrive at seemingly radical conclusions like anarchism, for example. People would view anarchism probably more crazily than they would Mormonism, a lot of people. But it's like, no, it's actually not that unreasonable a conclusion. You just have to examine the premises, and then you can get to the conclusion.
Well, see, one of the other reasons, that's all really well said, and one of the other reasons why I asked is I wondered if subjecting something to time and detention would make a difference in how seriously it should be taken by skeptics, right? So if we look at Christianity or just the idea of the belief in God, this goes back, this obviously predates philosophy, but philosophy has been there the whole time to have that discussion, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a tremendous amount of scholarship and argumentation on both sides of the issue. St. Thomas of Aquinas certainly comes to mind in defense of the existence of God. But Mormonism appears, mid-1800s, late 1800s. There is certainly less defense of it, especially into, when you consider the world into which it came, right, where there was already established Christian doctrine. Mormonism was thought to be, pretty far out there right from the beginning. It's certainly not being taken by and large any more seriously today. So I was just curious about the statement, but it comes from a place of complete ignorance. Someone says Mormonism, they give me the basics of the religion, the tenets of the religion. I say, oh yeah, that's crazy. I wouldn't say like all Mormons are clinically insane, right? But
so let me give you an
sure.
example if I can. I'm not a Mormon, but take the concept of God communicating to an individual human in the form of tablets. Now, in other words, God put some rules on some tablets and then gave those tablets to an individual human being to communicate the truths on those tablets, divine truths on those tablets to the world. If that sounds familiar, of course, that is the Ten Commandments from Moses. So if you accept that premise, that that's something that is possible, and I mean, the majority of humans throughout modern history have believed that that is the case, or at least that in theory that's the case. God could communicate divinely through Muhammad, and then Muhammad spoke to all the people. God divinely communicated to Moses, and then put his words on the tablets, and then communicated to the people. That exact same thing is what Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, was claiming. He said, look, an angel gave me these golden tablets, and I'm the only one that can decipher them. And here's what they say: you should follow obviously, you should follow the rules that are in these tablets because they come from God. So, like I said, if you accept the premise that God can communicate in this way, it's now more of an open question. It's, did it happen again? Especially if you take more of a kind of a universalist approach, that in principle, it's not just that one time God communicated to an individual. He did it with Moses. He did it with, maybe he even did it with the Buddha. He did it with Muhammad. He did it with Joseph Smith. He does it all over the place. There's kind of a universal truth that these religions are pointing at, and this is just one more manifestation of it. So that's is that self-evidently wrong? No, you have to examine all the concepts involved.
People can accept certain aspects of a religion, and then it's interesting how when it comes to this recent intervention from God with Joseph Smith, it's seen as ridiculous. Now, maybe there's more context to that story, like, was Joseph Smith consistent in the way he told his followers what happened?
Exactly.
Was he asked for evidence, and then did he claim that it was unavailable, or, that kind of thing?
Fascinating question. Who is the person of Joseph Smith, and what's his personal story? That's an interesting one that somebody should examine if they're looking at Mormonism.
Absolutely. So I think that, your discussion of logic led me to, wanting to talk about this article, because there is a great preponderance of people out there claiming to be very logical and very rigorous in their critical thinking, while basically outsourcing it completely.
Yes.
Right. And I think that's really, really important to point out. And I guess that's what this whole principle is basically warning against, because you'll you'll be given easy answers. You'll be given shortcuts to knowledge. And, I've taken plenty of them in the past, and I've gotten burned several times. And I just want to give an example of, I might have mentioned this, but this is where I came from, the world of conspiracy, and I didn't have a foundation in the basics for evaluating arguments when I started to go down that rabbit hole. And I didn't understand that most of the conspiracy theories that I was encountering, as a younger man, were basically entirely built on a collection of fallacies called fallacies of omission. right? The stacking the deck, the appeal to ignorance, the appeal to a lack of evidence. It was all the same tricks used over and over again. But I think, too, that it was the immersion in that world and the evaluation of those arguments that eventually made me aware enough to listen to somebody who's much smarter than most of the people who are perpetuating a whole range of conspiracy theories, to be able to watch Sam Harris and say something isn't right here, you know. So I think that was a useful example to have, but it was also a big burn. I wasted a ton of time in that world, you know, from not having an understanding of the principles that we've already discussed.
Yeah, and there's one thing I'll piggyback on that. This is kind of sad, at least from my perspective, that taking those shortcuts and kind of playing that game, especially in the world of ideas or in academia, will oftentimes result in you might call worldly success or fame, or you might become a well-respected intellectual in a field. I mean, this methodology of genuine radical skepticism is so rare, and it's not going to win you a lot of allies. There are reasons why Alex Jones is so popular, and he has a very, very passionate following, and it's because sometimes he plays a little fast and loose.
Yeah.
And so it's much easier to play to kind of get that insularity from people, have that insular group, and then monetize it. Or in academia, have the followers, or in the martial arts, have the little disciples that are going to follow you, even if your principles are wrong.
Well, yeah, I think it's easier to stack the deck if you don't know how many cards are in it or what the cards are. Right? You know, oh, this is one, I like this one, I like this one, I like this one. And I remember saying to somebody once, like, yeah, everything seems very easy to understand when you know almost nothing about it. And again, that takes us back to that idea of the intellectual safe space, right? I will, as a college student, be protected from having to think. You know, and I think we see that in the religious world. We see that in the Brights movement. We see that in traditional political settings. Protect me from having to do this hard work.
Yes, and you even see it in organizations. I mean, you see it in the for-profit and nonprofit world. There's this wonderful phrase that I heard. I think Tom Woods used it once in a lecture. He said it's the "what is best" fallacy. The idea that the way that things are being done is the best way to have them done. And this is something you see, it plagues even organizations. People don't have this fundamental skeptical methodology of, are we doing what we're doing the right way? Should we even be doing what we're doing? And you just get this blind inertia that, oh, well, what is best, because that's what is. Well, that's also a mistake in that. That's also a very dangerous fallacy. Though, again, if you play along with that fallacy and you keep doing what is being done, you'll probably land a nice job. Like you can probably succeed in the nonprofit world, or sometimes in the corporate world, or in the management world, just by kind of putting your head down and going with the flow, which I think is a real shame.
Yeah. Well, when we're 6 years old, we are, you know, or 5 now in the whole K through 12 scheme of things. We are invited to enter a world that is already buzzing right along. It was fine without us, but if we're polite and we behave, we can participate.
Right.
You know, and that's a dangerous kind of framework to set up, but that's what's happening, right? So if people in elementary school or in middle school or in high school become naysayers or, you know, sticks in the mud about they're not doing enough positive affirmation for the world as it is, right? That's a real problem. But that welcome to the world, you can participate as long as you behave. That, yes, it goes all the way to that handshake that lands you that you know, whatever corporate job you wanted, or yes, job in academia maybe. So yes, that is a huge problem, but it has roots very, very early in life, and that's one of the reasons why we do this.
Agreed.